The silence in the servants' quarters felt heavier than usual that morning, thick with the kind of tension that makes your skin prickle. Sarah Chen stood before the small, cracked mirror in her room, the red dress hanging from her trembling fingers like evidence of a crime she was about to commit. Outside, the winter sun struggled to break through the gray clouds hanging over Shadowpine Pack's compound, casting everything in a dim, colorless light that matched the knot of fear in her stomach. 2,190 days, 6 years, 72 months, 105,000 hours of invisible labor. The numbers had become a rhythm in her head, a drumbeat that marked every scrubbed floor, every changed linen, every moment she'd perfected the art of disappearing into walls. Her hands bore the evidence calluses layered over scars, knuckles rough, from chemical burns that Dr. Merrick had never been called to treat. Omegas didn't waste pack resources on minor injuries. That's what Mrs. Thornton said every time someone asked for medical attention. Minor injuries like infected cuts that left permanent marks. Minor injuries like the pneumonia that had killed Marie's daughter 3 winters ago, while bloodline wolves received antibiotics for common colds. The dress had cost her 3 months of wages. $847 saved coin by coin in a coffee tin buried beneath the loose floorboard under her narrow cot. The courage to wear it had cost her 6 years of silence. Sarah's roommate Iris sat on the edge of her bunk, dark eyes wide with a fear that had become second nature to Omega staff. Her fingers twisted the hem of her gray uniform, the same shapeless cotton that Sarah had worn for 2,190 days straight. Never read, never anything that suggested ambition or desire or the audacity to be seen. Iris finally broke the suffocating quiet between them. You know what they'll say. You know what they'll think. Sarah did know. She'd spent 6 years watching noble ladies parade through marble halls in their silks and jewels, while she scrubbed floors and changed linens, and disappeared into walls whenever someone important approached. She'd perfected invisibility not because she lacked courage, but because survival demanded it. The pack hierarchy wasn't just tradition, it was a prison with bars made of glances and whispers, and the constant grinding knowledge that your life mattered less than the comfort of those born into bloodline families. The architecture of the compound itself enforced the caste system. Bloodline wolves occupied the top 3 floors, spacious suites with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Olympic Peninsula's forest. Common wolves lived on the middle floors in smaller quarters, but still with natural light, still with heat that worked consistently. Omegas inhabited the basement. 12 adults crammed into a space designed for storage, sleeping on metal bunks bolted to concrete walls. One bathroom with cold water only. No windows. The heating system broke every winter, and maintenance requests disappeared into the same void as medical care approvals and wage increase petitions. Sarah had learned the rules on her first day. Never make eye contact with bloodline wolves. Speak only when spoken to. Eat after bloodlines finish from separate kitchens that serve their leftovers. No red clothing. Red signified ambition, reserved exclusively for those born into power. Sleep in the basement. Work 18-hour shifts when commanded. Accept that your value existed only in your ability to remain unseen. But something had broken inside her 3 months ago. Or maybe it had finally healed. She still wasn't sure which. The memory surfaced unbidden as it had every day since that Tuesday morning. Sarah had been cleaning Alpha Marcus Stone's study as she did every day before dawn, when most of the compound still slept. She'd perfected her routine to avoid him entirely, and at 4:30 a.m., out by 6, leaving his private wing spotless and untouched. 6 years of maintaining his space while never acknowledging her own existence within it. That morning she'd found him sterile there, slumped over his massive oak desk, with intelligence reports scattered across the surface like fallen leaves. Maps of territorial disputes with Red Ridge Pack marked in red ink. Financial statements showing deficits that made her chest tighten with worry she had no right to feel. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat at his elbow, and exhaustion lined his face even in sleep. Marcus Stone, Alpha of Shadowpine Pack, former Marine Corps colonel with 2 tours in Iraq and another in Afghanistan, still etched into the scars visible on his forearms when he rolled up his sleeves. 52 years old, ice-blue eyes that could freeze or ignite depending on his mood, and a commanding presence that made every room feel smaller when he entered. He'd taken over the pack 8 years ago after his father's death, and the older Omegas whispered that he'd tried to implement reforms in those early years. Tried and failed, worn down by the bloodline families who held the real power through their control of territory, trade routes, and pack finances. Sarah had stood frozen that morning, watching him sleep. He looked utterly alone in that moment, powerful and isolated in equal measure, carrying burdens that no amount of authority could lighten. Without thinking, without considering the consequences of touching an alpha without permission, she'd placed a blanket over his shoulders. His eyes had opened immediately, sharp ice blue, startling in their intensity. Combat reflexes from years of military service, the kind that never fully fade. For a heartbeat, they'd simply looked at each other, and Sarah had seen something flicker across his face that she couldn't name. Not anger, not surprise, something deeper, more complicated. His voice had been rough with sleep and alcohol when he finally spoke. "What's your name?" The question had hit harder than any reprimand. Sarah had curtsied, eyes dropping to the floor as training demanded. "Sarah Chen, Alpha." "How long have you worked here, Sarah?" "6 years, Alpha." The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. She'd felt his gaze studying her, really seeing her for perhaps the first time, despite her having cleaned his private quarters for 2,000 mornings in a row. When he finally spoke again, confusion and something that might have been sadness colored his words. "6 years, and I've never seen you." The truth of it shouldn't have hurt, but it did, because it was accurate. Sarah was excellent at her job precisely because she'd made herself unseeable, unnoticeable. A ghost in gray cotton who kept his spaces clean and his life ordered without ever imposing her existence upon his awareness. That's what Omegas did. That's what survival required. The words had slipped out before she could stop them, quiet but firm. "That's rather the point, Alpha. We're trained to be invisible." His expression had shifted, then something cracking in the carefully maintained mask of authority. "Who trained you to disappear?" "Everyone, Alpha. The system trains us from day one." She'd fled after that hard hammering, certain she'd crossed a line that would result in her dismissal or worse. Instead, the next day, Marcus had issued a decree that sent shockwaves through the entire pack. The formal announcement had come during the mandatory pack meeting with all 217 members gathered in the main hall. Marcus had stood on the raised platform where Alphas addressed their people. Garrett Reeves, his beta and former military brother-in-arms, at his right shoulder. Elena Frost and her sharp intelligence officer's gaze scanning the crowd from his left. Marcus's voice had carried authority that silenced even the whispered conversations among bloodline families. "In 2 weeks, Shadowpine Pack will hold our winter solstice gathering. This year, I'm issuing a new directive. All pack members are welcome to attend, regardless of rank. This is not a suggestion. This is pack law." The reaction had been immediate and visceral. Lady Vivian Blackwood had risen from her seat among the senior bloodlines, her perfectly composed features failing to hide the fury beneath. At 45, she controlled the Southern Territories through a combination of inherited wealth and ruthless political maneuvering. Her husband had died 5 years ago, under circumstances that were never fully investigated, and she'd consolidated power ever since, building a coalition of bloodline families who believed Omega existence threatened pack purity. Vivian's voice had dripped false concern. "Alpha, surely you mean Omegas will serve the gathering in a celebratory capacity, perhaps enjoy some refreshments afterward in their own quarters?" Marcus hadn't even blinked. "I mean what I said, Lady Blackwood. All members, full participation. Unless you'd like to question my authority to set pack law." The challenge hung in the air, and Vivian had been forced to sit, but the rage in her eyes promised future consequences. Around the hall bloodline, families exchanged shocked glances, while Omega staff stood frozen in confusion. Was this real? Was this a test designed to identify and punish those arrogant enough to accept? Mrs. Helena Thornton had called an emergency meeting of Omega staff that same evening. At 64, she'd spent 40 years climbing from Omega status to head of household through ruthless enforcement of the very hierarchy that oppressed her. She stood before the 32 Omega workers with her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her already severe features. Her voice had been ice. "The Alpha's decree is clearly meant as a gesture of goodwill. Omegas who attend will do so in service capacity only. You will help set up, serve food, and clean afterward. Any Omega who mistakes this for genuine invitation to participate as equals will be dismissed immediately. Am I understood? 32 voices had murmured agreement. 32 people choosing survival over hope because experience had taught them that hope was dangerous. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Marcus's expression when he'd said those words 6 years and I've never seen you. Couldn't stop replaying the way he'd looked at the Omega staff after their conversation, as if seeing them for the first time. Couldn't ignore the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd meant exactly what he said. So she'd started saving. 3 months of wages, every spare dollar, tucked into that coffee tin. And yesterday, on her rare afternoon off, she'd taken the bus into Port Angeles and bought the dress from a small boutique whose owner hadn't asked questions about why a woman in a threadbare coat was purchasing crimson silk. Now Sarah stood before her mirror, the dress feeling like armor and vulnerability all at once. The fabric was soft against her skin, a deep crimson that seemed to drink in what little light filtered through the basement's narrow windows near the ceiling. She'd never owned anything this beautiful, had never imagined herself worthy of beauty when her value existed solely in her ability to scrub and serve and disappear. Her pale blonde hair, usually pinned back in the severe bun required of palace staff, hung loose around her shoulders. She'd brushed it until it shone each stroke, a small act of rebellion she hadn't quite understood until this moment. Looking at her reflection, Sarah barely recognized herself, not because of the dress or the hair, but because of what showed in her eyes, something that looked dangerously like determination. Iris's voice cut through Sarah's thoughts, sharp with genuine fear. Mrs. Thornton called a meeting for after the gathering. All Omega staff required to attend. She's planning something, Sarah. Please, take off the dress. Stay here with me where it's safe. Safe. The word tasted like ash. Sarah had spent 6 years being safe, safe in her invisibility, safe in her compliance, safe in the slow grinding away of her humanity, one 18-hour shift at a time. Safety had cost her the use of her nursing license, the career she'd trained for before a car accident had killed her family and left her with nothing but trauma and the desperate need for pack protection. Safety meant watching Marie's daughter die from appendicitis because Dr. Owen Merrick wasn't allowed to waste medical resources on Omega children. Safety meant accepting that her life mattered less than a bloodline wolf's comfort. The fabric whispered around Sarah's ankles as she moved toward the door. Behind her, Iris made a small sound of distress but didn't try to stop her. What could she say that they both didn't already know? That Sarah was about to step off a cliff with no certainty of what lay below. That this single choice could result in her exile from the pack, leaving her vulnerable to the rogues and hostile packs that prowled the Olympic Peninsula. That courage and stupidity often looked identical until the consequences sorted themselves out. Sarah opened her door to find the corridor outside in chaos. Omega staff rushed back and forth, arms full of linens and silverware and flower arrangements for the gathering. The Winter Solstice celebration was Shadowpine Pack's largest annual event, a display of wealth and power designed to remind neighboring packs of their strength while reinforcing internal hierarchies through elaborate ceremony. Every detail had to be perfect, which meant Omegas had been working 20-hour shifts for the past week. At first, no one noticed Sarah. She was too familiar, too much a part of the background furniture after 6 years. But as she walked toward the main staircase that would take her from the basement to the grand entrance hall, heads began to turn. Conversations stuttered to a halt. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes, heard the whispers starting like wind through dry leaves. An older Omega named Thomas actually stopped walking, a stack of clean tablecloths tumbling from his arms to the concrete floor. His weathered face showed confusion warring with something that might have been awe. Thomas had worked for the pack for 34 years. He'd been beaten twice for imagined insubordination, his mate had died from untreated diabetes, and resignation had carved itself into the lines around his eyes. Now those eyes tracked Sarah's movement like she was a comet streaking across his familiar sky. The whispers grew louder as Sarah reached the basement stairs. Snatches of conversation followed her ascent. Is that Sarah Chen? Where did she get that dress? Does she think she's bloodline now? Mrs. Thornton is going to kill her. The Alpha said all members welcome. He didn't mean her, he couldn't have meant her. Sarah kept walking, even though her legs felt weak, even though every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to change into her uniform, to remember her place. But whose place? The one assigned to her by an accident of birth, the one enforced by wolves who'd never scrubbed a floor or wondered if they mattered, the one that said her nursing degree was worthless, her intelligence irrelevant, her humanity negotiable. The stairs stretched before her, concrete steps leading from the basement to the ground floor, then marble leading to the gathering spaces above. Sarah had climbed these stairs thousands of times, always with her eyes down, always carrying supplies or cleaning equipment, always with the weight of invisibility pressing her shoulders toward the ground. Today her spine straightened. Today each step felt like a declaration of war against gravity itself. She emerged onto the ground floor to find common wolves stopping mid-conversation, their reactions more varied than the Omegas. Some nodded with what looked like respect. Common wolves occupied a precarious position in the hierarchy above Omegas, but below bloodlines, never quite certain which direction their loyalty should flow. Others looked away quickly, as if acknowledging Sarah might contaminate them by association. A few younger wolves watched with undisguised curiosity, perhaps wondering if the rules they'd inherited might actually be changeable. The marble stairs stretched upward toward the main hall. Sarah gripped the banister, feeling the cool stone beneath her palm. Every surface in this compound had passed under her cleaning cloth at some point. She knew the location of every crack in the marble, every place where water damage had been imperfectly repaired, every corner that required extra attention, because bloodline wolves never noticed the labor that maintained their comfort. Now she climbed those stairs not as a cleaner, but as something she couldn't yet name. Not quite an equal, not quite a rebel, something in between, undefined and terrifying. The second-floor landing brought her face to face with bloodline wolves preparing for the gathering. Lady Jessica Blackwood, Vivian's daughter, stood with a cluster of young bloodline women, all dressed in elaborate gowns that probably cost more than Sarah earned in 5 years. Jessica's perfectly styled dark hair and cruel smile marked her as her mother's daughter in every way that mattered. Jessica's voice carried deliberate cruelty. "Look, everyone, the Omega thinks she's people." Laughter erupted from her companions, sharp cutting sounds that were designed to remind Sarah of her place with surgical precision. One of the other young women, whose name Sarah didn't know, actually covered her mouth in mock shock. "Is that red? Doesn't she know red is reserved for bloodlines? Or is she too stupid to understand basic pack law?" Sarah kept walking, not because the words didn't hurt, they did, each syllable a small wound, but because stopping meant accepting their judgment, meant agreeing that her birth determined her worth, meant spending another 6 years scrubbing floors while bloodline children learned to see her as furniture. Jessica's voice followed her up the stairs. "Mrs. Thornton is going to beat her bloody. Can't wait to watch." More laughter, but Sarah caught something beneath it. Uncertainty, because Marcus had issued that decree in front of the entire pack and everyone had heard it. All members welcome regardless of rank. If Sarah was punished for following the Alpha's direct order, what did that say about who really held power in Shadowpine Pack? The grand staircase opened before her, 20 wide marble steps descending from the second floor to the main entrance hall, where the gathering was already in full swing. Sarah stood at the top, looking down at the assembled pack, and felt time slow to a crawl. The main hall was a cathedral of excess. 3 massive chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, each one blazing with hundreds of candles that turned the room into a forest of dancing shadows and golden light. Long tables stretched the length of the space, groaning under the weight of roasted meats, glazed fruits, and bread still steaming from the ovens. The air was thick with competing scents: wine and wood smoke, expensive perfume, and the metallic tang of ambition that seemed to hang over every gathering of powerful people. But it was the silence that hit Sarah first. As she appeared at the top of the stairs, conversations died in ripples, spreading outward from the doorway like rings on water. Heads turned, forks paused halfway to mouths. The musicians in the gallery above faltered their melody, stumbling before the conductor frantically waved them back into rhythm. 217 pack members. Sarah had scrubbed these floors beneath their feet 1,000 times, always on her knees, always invisible. Now she walked across them, upright, and the weight of 217 stairs threatened to crush her where she stood. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus Stone stood with his inner circle. Garrett Reeves, the beta, stood at his right, 49 years old, with a warrior's build and the kind of loyalty that was earned through shared combat rather than inherited through bloodlines. Garrett had served under Marcus for 20 years, had saved his life during an ambush in Fallujah, carried the same scars and the same belief that competence mattered more than birth. His dark eyes tracked Sarah's descent with an expression she couldn't quite read. Elena Frost stood at Marcus's left, sharp and calculating in a charcoal dress that probably cost less than the Bloodline's gowns, but looked twice as elegant through sheer confidence. Former Army Intelligence NSA contractor, now Shadow Pine Pack's spy master, and the woman most Bloodlines feared more than they respected. Her pale eyes missed nothing, and Sarah suspected she'd already cataloged 17 different ways this evening could end in disaster. Sir Owen Merrick hovered near the group, 55 years old with a Navy corpsman's background and gentle hands that had set bones and stitched wounds for 3 decades. He joined Shadow Pine Pack 5 years ago, and Sarah had heard the other Omegas whisper that he'd fought Mrs. Thornton repeatedly over medical care restrictions. Fought and lost because pack hierarchy trumped medical ethics every time. And Marcus himself, dressed in black as always, the color making his pale eyes seem even more striking against tanned skin marked by years of outdoor operations. Power radiated from him in waves, not just the political power of his position, but something more primal, more dangerous. He was the kind of man who commanded attention simply by existing, who could silence a room with a look, who carried the weight of 217 lives on shoulders and that bore it without complaint but not without cost. He was looking directly at Sarah. Every person in that hall watched her descend. Every eye tracked each step. Every breath seemed to hold in anticipation of what would happen when she reached the bottom. Sarah forced herself to keep moving, even though her heart was trying to climb out of her throat. Each step felt like a small eternity. The music in the feast hall had faded into background noise, overwhelmed by the rushing in her ears. 10 steps? 9? 8. The chandeliers cast her shadow long across the marble, a dark counterpoint to the crimson dress. 7 steps. 6. She could see Marcus's expression now, unreadable but intense. 5 steps. 4. Garrett shifted his weight, positioning himself slightly in front of Marcus, protective instinct that had been honed in combat zones and never fully relaxed even in supposedly safe spaces. 3 steps. 2. The entire hall held its collective breath. 1 step. Ground floor. Sarah dropped into a curtsy, muscle memory overriding her nerves. 6 years of training demanded deference, even as her choice of dress declared rebellion. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, carrying across the sudden silence. Alpha Stone. Marcus didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, and Sarah could feel every eye in the entrance hall fixed on them. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze lowered, waiting, following the forms even as she violated them. Then Marcus spoke, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, sharp, cold, with an edge of something she couldn't quite identify. Anger, surprise, approval. "Where are you going dressed like that?" The question hung between them, weighted with more meaning than the simple words contained. Sarah lifted her eyes to meet his, and the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. His expression remained unreadable, that same intensity she'd glimpsed in his study, now focused entirely on her. It should have terrified her. Part of her wanted to apologize to Run, to explain that she'd misunderstood his decree, that she knew her place. But a stronger part, the part that had saved for 3 months to buy this dress, the part that was tired of being invisible, held firm. She drew a breath and let the truth fall between them like a gauntlet. "To the gathering, Alpha, as you commanded. All pack members are welcome tonight, regardless of rank." Something flickered in his eyes. The tension in his jaw shifted, but Sarah couldn't tell if he was angry or amused or something else entirely. Around them she heard gasps, whispers starting up again like wildfire catching dry grass. Marcus's voice went dangerously soft. "You quote my own words back to me. I only seek to follow them, Alpha." Behind Marcus, Garrett cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly trying to diffuse whatever was happening. "Marcus, perhaps we should—" Marcus cut him off without breaking eye contact with Sarah. "Leave us." The command was absolute. Sarah's stomach dropped as she watched Garrett, Elena, Dr. Merrick, and various courtiers who'd been watching their exchange begin to disperse. Not without backward glances and whispered speculations, but they moved. When the entrance hall had emptied enough that she and Marcus stood in a pocket of relative privacy, he took a step closer. He was tall enough that Sarah had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, and she caught the scent of cedar and something wilder like forest after rain. The proximity made her acutely aware of how vulnerable she'd made herself. One word from him could end her. Not just her employment, but her safety, her pack protection, everything that kept her alive in a world where lone wolves didn't survive long. Marcus's voice remained low enough that only she could hear. Do you know what you've done? I've worn a red dress to a gathering, Alpha. You've declared yourself. His eyes never left hers. Red is the color of ambition in this pack, of those who seek to rise, of those who refuse to accept the station they were born into. Sarah's blood went cold. She hadn't known that. In 6 years, no one had bothered to explain pack symbolism to an Omega because Omegas weren't expected to participate in symbolic gestures. They were expected to serve in gray and disappear. The words came out shakier than she'd wanted. Then I suppose I've been more honest than I intended. For the first time since she'd known him, Marcus Stone smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of his lips, but it transformed his face, softened the harsh planes, and made him look almost human, almost approachable. Almost like someone who understood what it cost to stand here in red silk while the entire pack waited to see if she'd be destroyed for her audacity. 6 years of invisibility. His voice carried something that might have been wonder. And you choose tonight to become visible. Why bang? The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected angered dismissal, perhaps in order to change. She hadn't expected curiosity, hadn't expected him to ask about her reasons, as if they mattered, as if she was a person whose motivations deserved consideration. The truth spilled out before she could stop it. Because I was tired of disappearing. Because you said everyone was welcome, and I wanted to believe that included people like me. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Sarah felt that same exposure she'd experienced in his study. The sense of being truly seen, all her defenses, stripped away, every vulnerability laid bare under his ice-blue gaze. People like you. He repeated the words, slowly tasting them. And what kind of person are you, Sarah Chen? Before Sarah could answer, a commotion erupted from the feast hall behind them. Raised voices, the crash of something breaking. A woman's sharp laugh cutting through the music. Marcus's attention snapped toward the sound, his expression hardening back into the cold mask she knew so well. When he looked back at Sarah, something had changed in his eyes, decision crystallizing into action. Stay close to me tonight. That's not a request. Before Sarah could process the command, Marcus's hands settled on the small of her back, guiding her toward the feast hall. The touch burned through the thin fabric of her dress, and she had approximately 3 seconds to wonder what she'd set in motion before they stepped through the massive doors and into a room full of people who were about to judge her for daring to exist in their space. The feast hall opened before them like a judgment. Sarah had prepared herself for hostility, but the reality was worse than imagination. Conversations didn't just stop, they died mid-syllable, as if her presence had literally stolen the air from the room. The musicians continued playing because Marcus's hand on her back kept her moving forward, kept her from freezing under the weight of collective disapproval. Bloodline families sat at tables arranged by political alliance and territorial control. The Blackwoods commanded the center tables, with Vivian presiding like a queen at her court. The Thorntons, no relation to Mrs. Helena Thornton, who'd bought her position through 40 years of enforcing Omega oppression, held the eastern tables. The Markhams, the Sterlings, the Vaughns, all arranged in careful hierarchy that reinforced who held power and who merely borrowed it. Common wolves filled the perimeter tables, their mixed reactions visible in postures that ranged from hostile to curious to carefully neutral. An Omega staff lined the walls, ready to serve their faces, showing confusion and something that looked dangerously like hope. 32 Omega workers watching Sarah walk across the floor they'd scrubbed yesterday, wearing a dress they'd never dared touch, on the arm of an Alpha who'd never before acknowledged their existence beyond functional necessity. Marcus guided Sarah toward the high table where his inner circle sat. Not at the far end where such a gesture might be dismissed as token charity, but directly beside his own seat. The symbolism was unmistakable, and Sarah heard the sharp intake of breath from several nobles as Marcus pulled out the chair himself. Vivian Blackwood rose from her seat with the fluid grace of a predator. At 45, she wore her power like the designer gown that probably cost more than most Omegas earned in a decade. Perfectly styled dark hair, flawless makeup, and a smile that promised violence beneath its veneer of civility. Her voice carried across the hall, crystalline and poisonous. Alpha, surely you don't intend for a servant to dine at the high table. I'm certain this is simply a misunderstanding. Marcus's hand remained on the back of Sarah's chair, his body language making his position clear even before he spoke. I intend for my guest to sit where I placed her, unless you'd like to question my judgment in my own hall. Lady Blackwood, the challenge landed like a physical blow. Vivian's perfect composure slipped for just a moment, fury flashing across her features before she recovered. Around the hall, the nine families exchanged glances, weighted with calculation. How far could they push? How much could they resist without triggering consequences they couldn't afford? Vivian's smile never wavered, but her eyes promised retribution. Of course not, Alpha. I merely seek to maintain proper standards. Tradition exists for good reasons. Tradition. Marcus let the word hang between them like a sword. Yes, let's discuss tradition. The tradition of judging worth by birth rather than character. The tradition of denying medical care to PAC members based on rank. The tradition of paying Omega workers wages that barely cover survival, while bloodlines live in luxury funded by PAC resources. Silence absolute. No one had ever heard Marcus speak like this in public. Behind Vivian, Lord Henrik, master of PAC finances, and one of her staunchest allies went pale. Because everyone in this room knew exactly what Marcus was referencing, and no one wanted those particular rocks overturned in front of witnesses. Marcus gestured towards Sarah's chair again. Sit, Sarah. You're my guest tonight. That makes you untouchable by anyone in this hall. Do you understand what that means? Sarah understood. It meant Marcus had just painted a target on her back while simultaneously daring anyone to act on their hostility. It meant she'd gone from invisible to the center of PAC politics in the span of 20 stairs and one crimson dress. It meant there was no going back now, no matter how terrifying the path forward appeared. She sat. The chair felt like a throne and a trap combined, positioned between Marcus's seat and Dr. Merrick's. Around them, the hall slowly returned to life as conversations resumed, though the undercurrent of gossip spread like wildfire through dry brush. Dr. Merrick leaned towards Sarah, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. Breathe, you look like you're facing a firing squad. Aren't I? His weathered face creased with something between amusement and respect. Fair point. For what it's worth, I've worked alongside you enough to know you're more competent than half the bloodlines at this table. Probably shouldn't say that out loud, but tonight seems to be the night for honesty. Garrett, seated across from them, poured wine into Sarah's glass, a servant's task that he performed himself, which earned another round of shocked whispers from those close enough to notice. Though I'll admit I'm curious about you. 6 years in the PAC, and I've never heard your name until this week. Sarah managed a small smile despite her terror. I was very good at my job. And what job was that? Garrett's voice held genuine curiosity. Being invisible, Elena, who'd been watching their exchange with inscrutable dark eyes, laughed softly. Well, she certainly failed at it tonight. Every person in this hall will remember your name by morning, Sarah Chen. Whether that's a blessing or a curse remains to be seen. She wasn't wrong. Sarah could feel the attention like physical pressure. Though most of the courtiers had learned to disguise their staring, they spoke to each other while watching her from the corners of their eyes, smiled at jokes while their gazes calculated and judged. Measured her worth and found it wanting simply because she existed in a space they believed belonged exclusively to them. Marcus had turned to speak with Lord Henrik about some matter of taxation, but his shoulder pressed against Sarah's, a point of contact that felt both accidental and deliberate. She focused on her plate, trying to remember how noble ladies ate. Small bites, elegant movements. Don't stuff your face like someone who spent 6 years eating leftovers in a basement. The food was extraordinary. Sarah had prepared meals like this 1,000 times, carrying trays from kitchen to table, while her stomach growled with hunger that wouldn't be satisfied until hours later, when the bloodlines had finished and abandoned their scraps. Now she ate duck glazed in cherry sauce vegetables that still had flavor instead of being overcooked to mush bread that was actually warm. Each bite felt like theft. Across the table, Vivian watched Sarah with predatory focus. Finally, she struck her voice, cutting through the relative quiet of their section. So tell me, Sarah, what prompted this transformation? Surely you must know how irregular it is. A servant dressed in red, seated at the Alpha's right hand. People will talk. People are already talking. Sarah met her gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. They were talking when I was invisible too. The only difference is that now I can hear them. Something flickered in Vivian's eyes, respect or rage, it was hard to tell. Brave words for someone in your position. What position is that exactly? Sarah kept her voice level. I was invited to this gathering. I came. I don't see the transgression. The transgression, Vivian leaned forward slightly, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against crystal wine glass like claws, is in forgetting your place. Marcus's voice cut through the exchange like a blade through silk. Lady Blackwood? He didn't raise his volume, but authority rolled through those two words. If you take issue with my decisions, you're welcome to voice them in private to me, not to my guest. The word hung in the air. Guest, not servant, not maid, not omega, but guest with all the protection and respect that word implied in pack culture. Sarah saw the calculation flash across Vivian's face as she weighed whether to push further. Saw the moment she decided against it, though the fury in her eyes promised this was far from over. Vivian smiled tightly and returned her attention to her wine. But the battle lines had been drawn, witnessed by hundreds of eyes. By defending Sarah by using that specific word, Marcus had elevated her in a way that couldn't be easily undone. And he'd made her a target. The meal continued in a blur of courses and tension. Sarah managed to eat small amounts, though her stomach was too knotted to accept much. Garrett asked her questions about her work in the compound, seeming genuinely interested in the details of running a household most nobles never thought about. Elena watched her with an intensity that made Sarah nervous, though she said little. Henrik ignored her entirely, which felt somehow more comfortable than hostility. Dr. Merrick proved unexpectedly kind. Between courses, he spoke quietly about the medical clinic he'd been trying to establish for Omega workers, the way Mrs. Thornton blocked every attempt, the frustration of watching preventable illnesses progress to crises because treatment was wasteful for lower-ranked pack members. I've seen you around the medical wing, he said, studying her with professional interest. You move like someone with training. Combat medic, Sarah shook her head. ER trauma nurse before I joined the pack. His eyebrows rose. Then why in God's name are you scrubbing floors instead of working in the clinic? Because no one asked, and Omegas aren't allowed skilled positions. Merrick's jaw tightened. That's going to change. Has to change. We're bleeding talent through stupidity and prejudice. He glanced at Marcus, who was listening despite his conversation with Henrik. Your Alpha seems to agree. It was only when the dancing began that things shifted again. The tables were pushed back, creating space in the center of the hall. The musicians struck up a waltz. Couples flowed onto the floor in a swirl of silk and jewels, moving through the steps with the ease of people who'd been trained in such things since childhood. Sarah had watched these dances from doorways and balconies for years, had even practiced the steps alone in empty rooms when she was sure no one would see. But watching and doing, there were different things entirely. The gap between observation and participation felt infinite. Marcus stood offering his hand. Dance with me. Sarah's heart stopped. Around them, she felt the room's attention sharpened to a razor's edge, felt Vivian's gaze burning into her back like a brand. Alpha, I'm not trained in... Neither am I, technically. The ghost of that earlier smile touched his lips. I learned from watching servants practice in the East Wing, when they thought no one was looking. I suspect you learned the same way. Somehow he'd known about those stolen moments, those secret practices in empty rooms where Sarah had pretended to be something other than invisible. The realization sent heat flooding through her embarrassment and something else, something that made her pulse quicken. Sarah took his hand. The crowd parted as Marcus led her to the center of the floor. Sarah could hear whispers rising like steam, could feel Vivian's rage as a tangible pressure. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to remember that servants didn't dance with alphas, that some lines existed for reasons beyond tradition. But Marcus's hand was warm in hers, his other hand settling at her waist with firmness that steadied her. When the music swelled, he moved and Sarah followed. They were not perfect. Sarah stumbled twice in the first minute, her body remembering the steps but struggling with the reality of another person's presence. Marcus compensated smoothly, guiding her through corrections with patience that surprised her. But they found rhythm eventually, and the room faded until it was just them. Just the music and the movement, and the strange intimacy of being this close to someone she'd only ever seen from a distance. Marcus's voice was barely audible over the music. Why are you really doing this? Doing what? All of this. The invitation, the high table, this dance. You are making me a spectacle. His eyes met hers and there was something raw in them. Something that looked almost like loneliness beneath the authority. Perhaps I'm tired of pretending that the walls between us make sense. Perhaps I'm tired of a court that values bloodline over worth. Or perhaps you're testing something. Sarah surprised herself with the boldness. Using me to prove a point to them. Marcus didn't deny it, which hurt more than it should have. Can it be both? Can I believe what I'm doing is right and also need to prove it? Before Sarah could answer, the music ended. The room erupted in polite applause that felt more like mockery than approval. They stood there still close, still connected by his hand at her waist and hers on his shoulder. The moment stretched between them, weighted with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Then Garrett appeared at Marcus's elbow, his face carefully blank in the way that meant trouble. Forgive the interruption, Alpha. There's an urgent matter that requires your attention. East Perimeter, security breach. Marcus's expression hardened instantly, the tender moment evaporating like morning mist. What kind of breach? Hunters Alpha, multiple contacts. Lord Henrik suggests you come immediately. Sarah felt Marcus's hands tighten fractionally before he released her, stepping back with obvious reluctance. His eyes found Garrett's and something passed between them, combat veteran communication that required no words. Garrett escorts Sarah back to No. Marcus cut himself off, decision crystallizing. Elena takes Sarah to the guest quarters in the East Wing. Assign her a guard. Make sure she's secure. The guest quarters, Elena's eyebrows rose slightly, but she moved immediately. Of course, Alpha. Marcus's gaze returned to Sarah one last time. Stay there. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except Elena or Garrett. Do you understand? The urgency in his voice, the fears Sarah saw flickering beneath his authority, made her nod. I understand. Promise me, Sarah. I promise, Alpha. He pressed a brief, hard kiss to her forehead, a gesture that felt both possessive and protective, that marked her as his in front of everyone watching. Then he was gone, striding from the hall with Henrik and 6 enforcers, leaving Sarah standing in the center of the dance floor, while the entire pack stared and whispered and judged. Elena appeared at her side, taking Sarah's arm with surprising gentleness. Come, quickly before the vultures descend. But they'd barely made it 5 steps when Vivian intercepted them, flanked by 2 other noble ladies Sarah recognized, but whose names she'd never learned. One was Lady Catherine Vaughn, whose cruel eyes suggested she enjoyed other people's suffering. The other was Lady Melissa Sterling, younger but no less vicious in her casual cruelty toward lower-ranked pack members. Vivian's smile could have cut glass. How fascinating. The little Omega has quite captured our Alpha's attention. Tell me, dear, what tricks did you use? Surely someone of your background must have employed some creative methods to achieve such a dramatic rise. The insinuation was clear. Sexual favors, manipulation, seduction. Around them, conversations stilled again as people leaned in to hear how Sarah would respond. Elena's hand tightened on her arm in warning, but Sarah felt rage burning through her fear. 6 years of swallowing insults. 6 years of accepting that her existence was somehow shameful. 6 years of watching bloodlines treat Omegas like property. Sarah's voice came out steadier than her shaking hands. I employed no tricks, Lady Blackwood. I simply accepted an invitation extended to all pack members. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should examine why. Vivian's eyes narrowed dangerously. Threatening, my dear girl, you're not threatening. You're amusing. A curiosity. Do you truly believe this will last? That tomorrow morning you won't wake up back in your servants' quarters scrubbing floors and changing linens, while tonight becomes nothing but an embarrassing memory? That's enough, Vivian. Elena's voice carried a warning edge. But Vivian ignored her, stepping closer to Sarah, close enough that Sarah could smell her expensive perfume. He's using you, you foolish child. You're a statement, not a person. And when he's made his point, you'll be discarded like everything else that no longer serves his purpose. The words hit like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed Sarah's own fears. Because part of her had thought the same thing from the moment Marcus's hand touched her back. Sarah forced herself to meet Vivian's gaze. Maybe. Or maybe you're just afraid that the world you've built your power on is more fragile than you thought. That bloodlines and titles matter less than you need them to. For a moment, shock flashed across Vivian's perfect face. Then fury, pure, undiluted rage that she barely managed to mask before spinning on her heel and stalking away, her companions scrambling to follow. Elena let out a low whistle. Well, you just made a very powerful enemy. I hope you're prepared for what comes next. Sarah wasn't, but it was too late to matter now. The guest quarters felt like a museum exhibit on wealth Sarah had only observed from the cleaning side, where she'd grown accustomed to bare concrete walls and a window so small it barely let in light. This chamber boasted tall windows with silk curtains in deep navy, a bed large enough for 3 people, and furniture that looked like it cost more than she'd earned in her entire time at the compound. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm shadows across walls papered in subtle patterns of silver and cream that probably required specialist installation. Sarah stood in the center of it all, still wearing the red dress that had started everything, feeling like an imposter in someone else's life. Through the window, she could see the eastern perimeter, where Marcus had gone darkness, punctuated by flashlights, and the occasional burst of what might have been gunfire. Her nursing training kicked in, automatically cataloging potential injuries, estimating response times, wondering if Dr. Merrick had gone with the Alpha or stayed behind. The door opened without warning. Sarah spun, hard hammering, but it was only the guard Elena had assigned. Thea Morrison, 38, former Army MP, built like she could break bones without effort, but moved with surprising grace. Her stern face showed no judgment, only professional assessment as she scanned the room's security features. Windows locked from inside. Don't open them. Thea's voice carried the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. I'll be outside your door. You need anything, knock twice. Anyone tries to enter without my clearance, scream. I'll handle it. Handle it how? Thea's hand rested on the combat knife at her hip. However necessary, the Alpha was very clear about your safety being non-negotiable. After Thea left, Sarah tried to sleep. Failed. The sounds from outside grew a bit louder around midnight, vehicles moving, raised voices, the organized chaos of emergency response. She paced the guest quarters, her feet silent on carpet that had never known the touch of her cleaning cloth, watching shadows move beyond the tree line. Sometime past 2 a.m., she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, many footsteps running, voices raised in urgency that made her blood freeze. Get Dr. Merrick now. Pressure on the wound, don't let him. Too much blood, he's not healing fast enough. Sarah's hand was on the door handle before conscious thought caught up. The promise she'd made Marcus echoed in her head, stay locked, don't open for anyone, but her nursing training overrode self-preservation. Those voices meant casualties, meant someone was hurt badly enough that werewolf healing couldn't compensate, meant her skills might be the difference between life and death. She cracked the door open to find chaos. Thea had moved down the corridor, weapon drawn, position between Sarah's room and whatever was happening near the main staircase. 4 enforcers were half carrying, half dragging Marcus between them. His black shirt was soaked dark with blood, more blood than should be possible, and his face had gone the color of old snow. Dr. Merrick appeared from the opposite direction, medical bag already open and barking orders. Get him to his chambers. I need clean water bandages, my surgical kit from the clinic, move. Sarah didn't think. She pushed past Thea's attempt to block her, ignoring the guard's protest, and ran toward the group. Garrett saw her first, his face a mask of controlled panic that meant the situation was worse than he wanted to admit. Sarah, you shouldn't, he began. I'm a registered nurse, ER trauma specialist. Sarah's voice came out steady despite her shaking hands. Let me help. Merrick's head snapped toward her, surprise flashing across his weathered features before professional assessment took over. He took in her posture, the way she'd automatically scanned Marcus's visible injuries, the clinical focus replacing the fear in her eyes. Can you handle arterial bleeds? Done it 100 times. Then get to his chambers. Now. They moved Marcus to his private suite rooms Sarah had cleaned for 6 years without ever truly seeing them. Now she registered details in fragmented snapshots, the massive bed they laid him on, maps and documents scattered across a desk, photographs on the wall showing Marcus in Marine Corps dress uniform alongside men who had the same 1,000-yard stare of combat veterans. A portrait of an older woman with kind eyes and graying hair hung above the fireplace, his mother Sarah remembered from compound gossip. Dead 8 years, the loss still visible in the care Marcus took with her image. But all of that faded as Merrick cut away Marcus's blood-soaked shirt, and Sarah saw the damage. 3 deep lacerations across his chest and shoulder, the tissue around them blackened in a way that made her stomach drop. Silver poisoning. Werewolves could heal almost anything except silver, which stopped regeneration and spread toxicity through their system like aggressive infection. Shrapnel, Sarah asked, already reaching for the medical supplies Merrick was unpacking. Silver rounds, custom load designed to fragment on impact. Merrick's jaw was tight. Some pieces are still embedded. I need to extract them before the poisoning spreads to major organs. Sarah moved to the basin, scrubbing her hands with the methodical precision drilled into her during nursing school. Around them, Garrett was dismissing the other enforcers, posting guards outside, securing the perimeter, with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done battlefield triage too many times. When the room cleared to just the 4 of them, Merrick, Sarah, Garrett, and Marcus barely conscious on the bed, the doctor met her eyes. This is going to be rough. Silver extraction without anesthesia because sedatives interact badly with werewolf metabolism. He'll fight us. Then we restrain him properly and work fast. Sarah positioned herself at Marcus's shoulder, her hands already assessing the wound depth. You extract, I'll control bleeding and watch for shock. Garrett, you hold him still. What followed was 30 minutes that felt like hours. Marcus's ice blue eyes opened periodically, clouded with pain, but tracking their movements with the focus of someone who'd been through worse and survived. When Merrick probed the first wound for embedded silver, Marcus's entire body went rigid, a low sound escaping through clenched teeth. Garrett pressed his shoulders down with the strength of someone who'd held wounded brothers through morphine-less field operations. Sarah worked with clinical precision that came from muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Pressure here to control bleeding, irrigation there to clear the wound field. Gauze replaced before blood saturation compromised visibility. Her hands moved steadily even as part of her brain screamed at the intimacy of this touching and Alpha's bare skin, seeing him vulnerable and bleeding, being trusted with his life in ways that 6 years of cleaning his quarters had never approached. Last piece, Merrick muttered, tweezers closing around a fragment of silver lodged near Marcus's collarbone. This one's deep. Sarah, be ready. When the silver came out, blood followed in a rush that required both their hands to control. Marcus made a sound that was almost a growl, his hands shooting out to grip Sarah's wrist with bruising strength. His eyes locked on hers, pale blue, gone almost white with pain, and for a heartbeat neither of them breathed. Almost done, Sarah said quietly, not pulling away despite the pressure on her wrist. You're doing fine, Alpha. Just a few more minutes. Something in her voice must have reached him through the pain fog, because his grip loosened fractionally. Not releasing, but no longer crushing. Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing, just held Marcus's other shoulder while Merrick sutured with the speed of someone who'd sewn up combat wounds under fire. When it was finally over, Marcus lay pale and still against blood-stained sheets, his breathing steadier, but his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Merrick cleaned his instruments with shaking hands that betrayed how close the situation had been. He'll heal now. Silver's out, wounds are clean. 24 hours and he'll be mobile. 48 until he's combat ready again. Merrick looked at Sarah with something approaching awe. Where did you train? Seattle Med. 5 years in their level 1 trauma center before the accident that killed my family. Sarah stripped off the bloodied gloves, her own hands finally starting to shake now that the crisis had passed. Joined the pack after. Mrs. Thornton said my skills weren't needed, that pack doctors handled medical care. Pack doctors who refused to treat half our members. Merrick's voice carried bitter anger. You could have saved lives to us. Marie's daughter for one. How many others died because your talent was wasted on scrubbing floors? The question hung in the air, accusatory not of Sarah, but of the system that had buried her competence beneath arbitrary hierarchy. Before anyone could answer, Marcus's hand moved, fingers curling around Sarah's wrist again, gentle this time, seeking rather than gripping. His voice came out rough, damaged by whatever sounds he'd made during the extraction. You stayed. You're bleeding all over your bed, Alpha. Chambers could wait. I told you to stay locked in your quarters. You also said all pack members have value regardless of rank. Seemed wasteful to let you die when I have training that could prevent it. The corner of Marcus's mouth twitched almost a smile. Insubordinate. Competent. Garrett made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly covered by a cough. Merrick busied himself packing away supplies, but Sarah caught the approval in his expression. Marcus's eyes drifted closed again, but his fingers remained loose around her wrist, a connection that felt more significant than touch alone. "Tell me what happened," Sarah said, looking at Garrett. "The hunters. How bad was it?" Garrett's expression went grim. "Bad. 12 hostiles with military-grade weapons and silver ammunition. They knew our patrol routes, knew which path Marcus would take, had positions already established when we arrived. This wasn't a raid, it was an ambush. Casualties. 3 of ours wounded 2 seriously. We took down 6 of theirs, captured 1 alive. The rest retreated." Garrett's jaw tightened. But Marcus took silver deliberately. Young enforcer named Daniels was in the kill zone. Commander threw himself in front of the rounds. Sarah looked at Marcus, whose eyes had opened again at Garrett's words. "You saved someone's life by nearly dying yourself. That's what leaders do." His voice was getting stronger, werewolf healing already starting to compensate now that the silver was removed. "Daniels has a mate and a son. I have had responsibilities." "Had," Merrick's head snapped up. "Have. Still have." Marcus's eyes found Sarah's, though they're more complicated than they were yesterday. The weight of that statement settled over the room. Yesterday, Sarah had been invisible. Today, she'd worn red, danced with an alpha, and held his life in her blood-stained hands. Tomorrow, the entire pack would know that Marcus Stone had bled in front of an Omega and survived because of her competence. The implications would ripple through Shadowpine's hierarchy like silver poisoning through unprepared tissue. Garrett cleared his throat, the sound deliberate. "Marcus the prisoner. The hunter we captured." He said something before he lost consciousness. What did he say? That someone told them you'd come personally, that they had your exact route and timing, that this was supposed to look like a random attack, but was actually a targeted assassination. Silence fell like a hammer. Sarah felt Marcus's hand tighten on her wrist again, not from pain, but from rage barely contained. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold precision of someone planning tactical response. "Inside information. Someone in this pack gave hunters my movement patterns." It gets worse. Garrett looked like he'd rather face the hunters again than deliver this next part. Elena ran preliminary traces on the weapons. Custom silver rounds manufactured locally within the last month. Purchased through an account registered to a shell company. She's working on tracking the real buyer, but the sophistication suggests someone with significant resources. "Bloodline families." Sarah heard herself say it before conscious thought caught up. 3 sets of eyes turned toward her. The only pack members with that kind of money and local connections, and the only ones threatened by what Marcus is trying to change. Merrick nodded slowly. "The Omega's right. Common wolves don't have those resources. Other Omegas certainly don't. This points to bloodlines protecting their position." "Vivian." Marcus's voice went flat dead. "She has the money, the connections, and the motive. I publicly humiliated her tonight while elevating Sarah. That's cause for retaliation in her world." "Can't prove it yet," Garrett cautioned. "Elena needs more time to trace the financial trail. But my instincts agree with yours, and my instincts kept us alive in Fallujah." Marcus tried to sit up, made it halfway before Merrick pushed him back down with surprising firmness for a man 20 years older. "You stay in that bed for at least 6 hours, or I'll sedate you myself and deal with the metabolism complications." Doctor's orders, Alpha. For a moment, tension crackled as 2 strong wills collided. Then Marcus subsided, though frustration radiated from every line of his body. "Fine, 6 hours, but I want Elena here immediately with whatever intelligence she's gathered. I want security doubled on all approaches. I want the prisoner isolated and under constant observation. And I want—" His eyes found Sarah's. "I want Sarah under guard at all times. If they targeted me, they'll target her next as the most visible symbol of pack reform." "Already assigned Thea," Garrett confirmed. "But Sarah should probably return to guest quarters before pack members wake and start asking why she spent the night in your chambers, covered in your blood." Reality crashed back. Sarah looked down at herself, the red dress ruined beyond repair, blood soaking through silk that had cost 3 months of wages, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline crash. She looked like she'd survived a massacre, which in a way she had. Marcus's fingers slipped from her wrist reluctantly. Thank you. For staying. For helping. For being competent when I needed competence more than protocol. That's what nurses do, Alpha. We help people bleed less. The ghost of his earlier smile returned. Stay close. I meant what I said before. You're under my protection now. Anyone who wants to harm you goes through me. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Garrett escorted her back to the guest quarters where Thea waited with clean clothes, practical pants, and a sweater that fit reasonably well, borrowed from Elena's wardrobe. As Sarah scrubbed blood from her skin in the private bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back had saved an Alpha's life, had pushed past 6 years of conditioning that said her skills were worthless, had stood in an operating theater, improvised from a bedroom, and done the work she trained for the work that had been denied her because some wolves believed birth determined worth more than ability. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight had guaranteed it. Sarah crawled into the enormous bed as dawn light began filtering through the windows. She'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, had danced with an Alpha, and then kept him from bleeding out, had made an enemy of the pack's most powerful bloodline family, and earned the protection of its leader. Sleep should have been impossible, but exhaustion pulled her under within minutes, dragging her into dreams where silver rounds became red dresses and blood on her hands transformed into power she'd never imagined possessing. She woke to knocking. Thea's voice filtered through the door. Sarah, Elena's here, says it's urgent. Sunlight streamed through the windows late morning by the angle, meaning she'd slept maybe 4 hours. Sarah's body protested, movement muscles sore from tension, but she forced herself upright and opened the door to find Elena waiting with the predatory focus of someone who'd spent the night hunting information instead of sleeping. Conference room now. Marcus is up and functional despite Merrick's protests, and we've got developments you need to hear. The conference room turned out to be a smaller space off Marcus's office, dominated by a table covered in maps, financial documents, and laptop computers showing data streams Sarah couldn't immediately parse. Marcus sat at the head, moving stiffly, but with more color in his face than she'd expected after last night's blood loss. Garrett stood behind him, and Merrick hovered nearby with the disapproving expression of a doctor whose orders had been ignored. Marcus's eyes found Sarah immediately. How much do you know about pack finances? Only what I've observed. Bloodline families control trade routes and territory. They collect revenues that supposedly fund pack operations, but Omega staff rarely see evidence of resource allocation that matches reported income. Spoken like someone who pays attention. Elena activated one of the laptop screens projecting financial statements onto the wall. Here's what the books show. Annual pack revenue from territory rights, trade taxes, and resource extraction, $4.2 million. Operating expenses, $3.8 million, leaving a comfortable surplus for emergencies and capital improvements. She pulled up another document. Here's reality. Actual operating expenses run closer to $2 million when you audit properly, which means $2 million goes missing every year. Has been for at least 5 years, possibly longer. Sarah's mind did the math automatically. $10 million. Someone's been embezzling $10 million from PAC funds. Someone's, Garrett said, his voice hard, or someone's, plural, because this level of theft requires coordination across multiple families to hide the paper trail. Elena's fingers flew across her keyboard, bringing up a network diagram that looked like a spider's web. Names connected by lines representing financial transactions, shell companies' offshore accounts. At the center of the web, one name appeared more frequently than any other. Lady Vivian Blackwood. She's been siphoning PAC funds for 5 years minimum, Elena continued, her voice clinical, despite the implications. False vendor invoices for supplies that were never delivered. Inflated costs for territory maintenance that never happened. Kickbacks disguised as consultant fees. And she's not alone. 6 other bloodline families are implicated. She highlighted names as she spoke. Lord Henrik Thornton, no relation to Mrs. Helena Thornton, but equally invested in maintaining hierarchy. Lady Catherine Vaughan. Lord Thomas Markham. Lady Melissa Sterling. Lord Richard Chen. Sarah felt her stomach drop at that one, wondering if they were related, if some distant bloodline connection existed that she'd never known about. Lady Jennifer Cross. 7 families, Marcus said quietly. 7 families representing approximately 60% of bloodline voting power in PAC governance, all stealing from collective resources while preaching about proper order and traditional values. There's more. Elena pulled up encrypted communications messages she'd somehow accessed through means Sarah suspected were illegal even by PAC standards. They've been coordinating. Group chat going back 18 months calls themselves the Council of Blood. Their stated purpose is preserving bloodline integrity and PAC purity. Sarah leaned forward, reading over Elena's shoulder. The messages were damning. The Alpha grows weak. Reform rhetoric threatens our position. Omega's gaining confidence. This cannot continue. Traditional hierarchy exists for good reasons. We must remind him. Meeting Thursday, private room at the Riverside Hotel. Plans require finalization. And then 3 weeks ago, a message that made Sarah's blood run cold. Contact established with Red Ridge Pack Hunters. Assets available for permanent solution. Timeline TBD. They hired the hunters, Sarah breathed. Vivian and her counsel paid for the assassination attempt. Can't prove it definitively yet, Garrett cautioned. Message doesn't explicitly reference the attack. Good lawyers could argue it meant something else. But combined with the financial evidence and the custom silver rounds purchased through one of their shell companies, Elena's smile was sharp. We can prove conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of PAC resources. That's enough to strip titles and seize assets under PAC law. The assassination attempt is harder to prosecute, but easier to use for political pressure. Marcus stood moving to the window that overlooked the compound's main grounds. Below PAC life continued, wolves heading to work, children playing the ordinary business of a community that didn't know how close they'd come to losing their alpha. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed from it. They wanted war. They'll get one, but not the kind they expected. He turned back to face the room. We're calling an emergency PAC council, us today. Every bloodline representative, every common wolf delegate, full Omega staff presence. Mandatory attendance under PAC law. They'll know something's wrong, Garrett warned. Vivian will suspect we've found evidence. Good. Let her suspect. Let her scramble to cover her tracks or prepare her defense. It won't matter. Marcus's eyes were ice blue steel. Because we're not just exposing corruption. We're dismantling the system that enabled it. Complete restructuring of PAC governance, immediate implementation. No warning, no negotiation, no mercy for those who've been stealing from their own people while claiming moral superiority. He looked at Sarah, then really looked at her. I need you there. Front row visible. Not as a witness, but as a symbol of what this PAC is going to become. Can you do that? Sarah thought about 6 years of invisibility. Thought about Marie's daughter dying from appendicitis that could have been treated. Thought about 32 Omega workers eating scraps and sleeping in basements, while bloodline families lived in luxury funded by stolen money. Thought about the red dress now ruined and the promise it had represented that maybe courage mattered more than birth. Yes, Alpha, I can do that. Then let's prepare for war. The next 6 hours were controlled chaos. Elena compiled evidence into prosecutable format, cross-referencing bank statements with PAC financial records and building timelines that even corrupt lawyers couldn't dispute. Garrett coordinated security, positioning loyal enforcers throughout the compound and running background checks on every guard assigned to the council chamber. Merrick documented Omega medical neglect cases with clinical precision, building a pattern of systematic abuse that supported the broader corruption charges. And Sarah found herself in an unexpected role, spokesperson for Omega staff who'd never had a voice in PAC governance. Elena had suggested it, Marcus had agreed, and suddenly Sarah was interviewing 32 workers about their experiences, documenting abuses, compiling testimony that would be presented publicly for the first time in PAC history. Marie, the elderly Omega who'd blessed Sarah's dress the night before, sat across from her in the guest quarters with tears streaming down weathered cheeks. My daughter Elisa died 7 years ago. 14 years old, complained of stomach pain for 2 days. Mrs. Thornton said Omegas don't waste PAC resources on minor complaints. By the time Dr. Merrick was finally allowed to see her, The appendix had ruptured. Sepsis killed her within hours. Sarah's hands shook as she wrote it down. Why didn't you push harder? Demand treatment. Because I'd seen what happened to Omegas who demanded. Thomas was beaten unconscious 3 years ago for making eye contact with Lord Henrik. Jenny was exiled for speaking out of turn during a pack meeting. We learn to stay quiet or we don't survive. Marie gripped Sarah's hand. But you didn't stay quiet. You wore red and danced with the Alpha and saved his life. Maybe that means things can actually change. They will change, Sarah promised, hoping it was true. Today, I swear to you, Marie, today things change. By the time the emergency council convened, evidence was compiled. Witnesses prepared and security locked down tight enough that even Vivian's resources couldn't breach it. The council chamber was a vast circular room, designed so no seat held more prominence than another symbolic equality that everyone knew was fiction. Real power sat where it always had with bloodlines who commanded wealth and territory. Until today. Sarah entered the chamber on Elena's arm wearing borrowed clothes that actually fit properly and carrying herself with the posture of someone who'd earned her place through competence rather than inherited it through birth. Thea shadowed them hand never far from her weapon. The room fell silent as they entered 217 pack members, tracking their movement. Marcus stood at the chamber's center, Garrett at his right. The High Council table seated 24 bloodline representatives, including Vivian, who looked serene and confident. Too confident, Sarah thought. She doesn't know what's coming. Marcus's voice carried authority that silenced even whispered conversations. This council is called to order under emergency protocols. The agenda has one item addressing systematic corruption within PAC governance and immediate implementation of reforms. Lady Blackwood has requested to speak first. The floor is yours. Vivian rose with practiced grace, her designer suit probably costing more than most Omegas earned in a year. When she spoke, concern dripped from every word like honey laced with arsenic. Alpha Stone, we gather today because of concerns that have been raised by multiple bloodline families. Concerns about your recent decisions and their impact on PAC stability. We believe you've allowed personal interests to compromise your judgment. She didn't look at Sarah, but the implication was clear. The elevation of an Omega to inappropriate status has created confusion about hierarchy. The attack by hunters 2 nights ago demonstrates how distraction weakens our security. And now this emergency council called without proper notice suggests you're acting rashly rather than consulting with those who have governed alongside your family for generations. Vivian paused, letting her words settle. Therefore, the Council of Blood, representing 7 bloodline families controlling 60% of voting authority, formally requests you reaffirm traditional PAC structure. Send the Omega back to appropriate duties. Restore clear hierarchy. Focus on security rather than social experimentation. If you cannot do this, we must consider whether Shadowpine's leadership requires adjustment. The threat was unmistakable. 7 families withdrawing support would cripple Marcus's ability to govern. Other bloodlines would follow, and an alpha without PAC backing was just a man with a title. Around the chamber, wolves shifted uncomfortably. This was unprecedented direct challenge to an alpha's authority in front of the entire pack. Marcus remained still, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, and Sarah recognized that same dangerous edge from the night of the gathering. The Council of Blood. Interesting name. Elena, would you care to explain what that council has been doing for the last 5 years? Elena stepped forward, activating screens around the chamber that displayed financial records in devastating detail. Ladies and gentlemen of Shadowpine PAC, I present evidence of systematic embezzlement totaling $10 million over 5 years, stolen from collective PAC resources by 7 bloodline families who believed their birth entitled them to rob their own people. The chamber erupted, shouts of denial from the implicated families, gasps of shock from everyone else, Vivian's serene mask finally cracking to show the fury beneath. Marcus let it continue for 30 seconds before his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Silence, or I'll clear this chamber and proceed without witness. Instant quiet. Elena continued, methodical and merciless, walking the council through every false invoice, every shell company, every offshore account. She displayed the encrypted messages, the planning, the conspiracy. And when she reached the communication about permanent solution and Red Ridge PAC hunters, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. They paid for the assassination attempt. someone shouted from the common wolf section. They tried to kill the AlphaKing. We can't prove the assassination link definitively, Marcus said, his voice carrying across renewed chaos. But we can prove everything else. Vivian Blackwood, Henrik Thornton, and 5 other bloodline families have been systematically stealing from this pack while preaching about traditional values and proper hierarchy. They've embezzled funds meant for security medical care infrastructure. They've enriched themselves while Omega workers went without heat in winter and children died from preventable illness because medical resources were limited. He gestured toward Sarah. Lady Blackwood questions my judgment, suggests I'm distracted by personal interests. Let me clarify something. Sarah Chen is a registered nurse with ER trauma experience who's been scrubbing floors for 6 years because this pack's hierarchy is so broken we waste talent and let people die rather than acknowledge competence. 2 nights ago, she saved my life when I took silver protecting a young enforcer. She has more integrity in her smallest finger than the Council of Blood possesses collectively. Marcus's gaze swept the chamber, landing on each bloodline representative in turn. You want me to reaffirm traditional structure? Fine. Here's tradition. Alphas who betray their packs are exiled. Families who steal from collective resources forfeit their assets. Wolves who endanger their packmates through conspiracy lose their protection. He pulled out a document, holding it high. By pack law and my authority as Alpha, I'm stripping titles from 7 bloodline families effective immediately. Their lands revert to pack control. Their voting authority is dissolved. And they have until sunset tomorrow to remove themselves from Shadowpine territory or face prosecution under both pack and human law. Vivian finally found her voice shaking with rage. You can't do this. We have rights. You have evidence of criminal conspiracy documented in your own encrypted communications. Elena's voice was ice. I've already contacted FBI Agent Morrison, White Collar Crime Division. They're very interested in the interstate wire fraud and racketeering implications. You're welcome to fight the pack law charges in human court, but that opens you to federal prosecution. Your choice, Lady Blackwood. Leave quietly or explain your shell companies to the FBI. The fight drained from Vivian's face, replaced by calculation. She'd been outplayed completely, her conspiracy exposed, her leverage destroyed. Around her, the other 6 families looked equally trapped. One by one, they stood and walked from the chamber, their footsteps echoing in silence so complete Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. When they'd gone, Marcus addressed the remaining pack members. This is just the beginning. Pack governance changes today. Effective immediately, council representation will be based on merit rather than bloodline. Omega staff will have voting delegates. Common wolves will have equal authority to remaining bloodlines. Medical care, housing, wages, all will be restructured to reflect actual need rather than birth status. Anyone who can't accept these changes is welcome to leave. Everyone else, let's build something better. The chamber exploded in sound cheers from Omegas and common wolves, stunned silence from remaining bloodlines, the noise of a world turning upside down. Sarah found herself mobbed by Omega workers, Marie crying and thanking her, Thomas shaking her hand with tears in his weathered eyes, others simply touching her as if to confirm she was real. Through the chaos, Marcus's eyes found hers across the chamber. He didn't smile, didn't move, just held her gaze with an intensity that made her chest tight. They'd done it. They'd broken a corrupt system and lived to tell about it. But Sarah knew with certainty that this was only the first battle. Vivian would regroup, other bloodlines would resist, and tomorrow would bring consequences neither of them could fully anticipate. But tonight they'd won, and sometimes winning was enough. 3 months passed like a fever dream compressed into waking hours. Sarah learned that revolution wasn't a single dramatic moment, but rather the grinding daily work of dismantling old systems while building new ones from salvaged pieces. Every morning brought challenges that 6 years of invisibility hadn't prepared her for, mediating disputes between bloodlines and common wolves, allocating resources fairly when fairness itself was a concept the pack had never properly defined, proving again and again that merit mattered more than birth to wolves who'd spent lifetimes believing the opposite. The Omega Advocacy Office occupied what had been Lady Vivian's private salon, a deliberate choice by Marcus that sent clear signals about power redistribution. Sarah sat behind a desk that still smelled faintly of expensive perfume, reviewing medical access requests that had piled up overnight. Merrick's clinic now treated all pack members regardless of rank, but 3 months of neglected care meant a backlog of cases that would take years to fully address. Marie knocked on the open door, her weathered face showing energy that hadn't been there 12 weeks ago. At 68, she'd finally received the knee surgery denied for a decade, and now she walked without the limp that had marked her for so long. She carried a stack of files, more Omega workers requesting educational programs, job training opportunities that had been systematically denied under the old hierarchy. 12 new applications this morning, Marie said, setting the files on Sarah's desk. 3 want GED programs, 4 requesting vocational training, 5 asking about college enrollment assistance. Thomas wants to study engineering. Can you imagine 34 years scrubbing floors, and the man wants to become an engineer at 57 years old? Sarah could imagine it because she saw it everywhere, wolves discovering talents and ambitions they'd suppressed for survival, realizing that maybe their dreams weren't impossible after all. The PAC's education fund recovered from Vivian's embezzlement and redirected toward actual development, now funded programs for any member who demonstrated commitment. Bloodlines had initially protested, arguing that limited resources meant prioritizing those most likely to succeed. Marcus had shut that down with brutal efficiency. Resources weren't nearly as limited once you stopped letting 7 families steal $2 million annually. Approve all of them, Sarah said, signing off on the applications. And tell Thomas that Marcus specifically requested updates on any Omega pursuing technical skills. The Alpha's been talking about infrastructure improvements that'll require engineers who actually understand how the compound operates from the ground up. Marie's smile could have lit the room. You know what's funny? 6 months ago, I'd have told Thomas he was being foolish, that people like us don't become engineers. Now I can't remember why I ever believed that, because the system trained you to believe it, same way it trained me. Sarah glanced at the framed photograph on her desk, herself in nursing scrubs, from her Seattle med days back when she'd had a different life and different dreams before the accident that killed her family. The difference is we're unlearning it now, slowly, painfully, but we're doing it. After Marie left, Sarah reviewed the morning's security briefing that Garrett sent to all senior staff. Vivian Blackwood remained in exile at her southern estate, but intelligence suggested she was meeting regularly with representatives from other PACs, Red Ridge, Silverpine, Northwood, building alliances, spreading her version of events, painting Marcus as a radical who'd destroyed traditional PAC values. 3 neighboring PACs had already declined trade agreements they'd maintained for decades, citing concerns about Shadowpine's instability. The political isolation would have been more concerning if Shadowpine wasn't thriving despite it. Common wolves who'd previously lived paycheck to paycheck now earned fair wages. Omega workers had housing with heat and windows. The medical clinic treated everyone regardless of rank, which meant infant mortality had dropped 60% in 3 months. Crime was down 40% because desperation no longer drove theft and violence. The PAC was healthier, safer, more productive than it had been in years. But success bred resentment among those who'd benefited from the old system. 5 bloodline families remained in Shadowpine after Vivian's exile, and their cooperation ranged from grudging to actively obstructionist. They attended council meetings because PAC law required it, voted against reforms on principle, and spread rumors that Marcus's leadership was weak because he relied on advice from unsuitable sources, meaning Sarah, meaning Elena, meaning anyone who'd risen through competence rather than birth. Sarah's desk phone rang. Elena's voice came through, clipped and tense. Conference room. Now we've got a situation. The conference room had become their war room over the past 3 months, walls covered in maps and timelines and intelligence reports that Elena updated obsessively. Today, Marcus stood at the window overlooking the compound's eastern approach, his posture radiating the kind of controlled tension that preceded action. Garrett was pulling up satellite imagery on the main screen, while Dr. Merrick looked uncharacteristically grim. Marcus turned as Sarah entered, his ice blue eyes sharp with focus. Vivian's making her move. Elena intercepted communications 2 hours ago. She's planning a formal challenge at the spring coronation. The spring coronation was Shadowpine's most sacred ceremony, an annual event where the Alpha renewed vows to the PAC and the PAC reaffirmed their loyalty. Tradition dictated it was held at the sacred grounds in the forest, a clearing consecrated by generations of Alphas going back 200 years. 500 PAC members would attend, along with delegates from allied packs, making it the largest gathering of the year. Formal challenge how? Sarah asked, though dread was already forming in her stomach. Elena pulled up decoded messages on a secondary screen. She's not just coming to disrupt. She's hired mercenaries, 20 former Special Forces operatives with werewolf combat experience. The plan is to attack during the ceremony itself, during the moment of renewal, when tradition requires Marcus to be unarmed and unguarded. Kill him, publicly claim the attack proves his leadership has made the pack vulnerable, install a puppet alpha from one of her allied families. That's suicide, Garrett said flatly. Attacking during sacred ceremony, every pack in the region would turn on her. Unless she wins, Marcus countered. If she succeeds, she controls the narrative. Says she was defending tradition against an alpha who'd gone rogue. Positions herself as the pack's savior rather than its destroyer. Other bloodline families would support her version because the alternative is admitting they've been complicit in reform. Sarah studied the intelligence reports, her nursing background, automatically assessing casualty projections. 20 trained mercenaries with silver weapons against ceremonial guards. They'd cut through security in minutes. Civilian casualties would be catastrophic. Which is why we're not letting it happen. Marcus moved to the tactical map Garrett had spread across the table. The coronation is in 3 weeks. That gives us time to prepare, but not much. Canceling isn't an option. It would show weakness and violate tradition in ways that would undermine everything we've built. So we proceed, but we turn their ambush into our trap. Walk me through it, Elena said, her fingers already flying across her keyboard to pull up relevant data. Garrett took point on the tactical briefing, his military background, evident in the precision of his planning. Traditional ceremony requires Alpha to enter the sacred grounds alone, unarmed, wearing ceremonial robes. Security stays on the perimeter, weapons remain outside the consecrated space. Vivian's counting on that tradition to make Marcus vulnerable. So we changed tradition, Sarah said. The others looked at her. What we've been changing, everything else. Why is this different? Because it's sacred, Dr. Merrick explained gently. Some traditions carry weight beyond politics. The coronation ceremony has been performed the same way for 2 centuries. Altering it risks alienating even wolves who support reform. Marcus's expression remained thoughtful. Unless we alter it in ways that honor the spirit while adapting to reality. Garrett, what if we maintain the appearance of tradition while embedding security throughout the ceremony itself? Explain. I enter alone and unarmed as required, but we position trained fighters among the pack members, themselves common wolves and omegas who've been through tactical training. They attend as witnesses, which tradition allows, but they're actually a defensive perimeter disguised as civilians. When Vivian's mercenaries attack, they're not facing ceremonial guards on the perimeter. They're surrounded by combatants embedded in the crowd. Garrett's eyes lit with professional appreciation. Asymmetric defense. They're expecting soft targets and minimal resistance. Instead, they walk into a kill box populated by wolves they've underestimated. I like it, but it requires extensive training with pack members who've never seen combat. Then we start training today, Marcus said. Volunteers, only common wolves and omegas who want to actively defend the pack. Elena handles intelligence and counterintelligence. Merrick prepares trauma response for casualties because there will be casualties. Sarah coordinates civilian evacuation protocols because we need non-combatants away from the kill zone. Sarah's medical training was already gaming out scenarios. We'll need triage stations, clear evacuation routes, communication systems that don't rely on technology since silver rounds can disable electronics. And we need to drill this repeatedly because panic kills more people than bullets in mass casualty events. Agreed. 3 weeks. 21 days to turn pack members into a defensive force capable of repelling trained mercenaries while protecting civilians and maintaining enough ceremonial appearance that we don't violate sacred tradition. Marcus looked at each of them in turn. This is going to be brutal. Training will push people beyond what they think they're capable of. Some will quit. Some will get hurt even in practice. But if we succeed, we prove that the new Shadow Pine is stronger than the old one. That merit and competence beat birthright and entitlement. Questions. 1, Sarah said quietly. What happens if Vivian wins? If the mercenaries succeed despite our preparations? Marcus met her eyes with the same intensity he had shown the night they danced. then everything we've built dies with me, and wolves like you go back to being invisible, which is why failure isn't an option. The next 3 weeks became a crucible that tested everything Shadowpine had become. Garrett designed training programs that combine werewolf combat instincts with human tactical thinking, teaching common wolves and omegas to fight in coordinated teams rather than as individuals to use terrain and positioning to offset the mercenaries' superior equipment and experience. 50 volunteers signed up initially. By the end of week 175 pack members were training 6 hours daily on top of their regular jobs. Sarah found herself running medical training for 30 volunteers who wanted to serve as field medics during the ceremony. Most had no prior experience, but desperation made them fast learners. She taught them to recognize arterial bleeds, pack wounds to slow bleeding without stopping circulation, identify shock symptoms, prioritize casualties in triage situations where resources were limited. Thomas the Omega, who wanted to study engineering, proved to have steady hands and cool judgment under pressure. Marie couldn't physically fight but memorized evacuation routes and practiced guiding civilians to safety with calm efficiency that came from surviving 6 decades of crisis. Elena's intelligence network expanded exponentially as Omega workers who'd been ignored for years suddenly became valuable assets. They'd spent lifetimes being invisible, moving through spaces without being noticed. Hearing conversations, bloodlines never guarded around servants. Now they fed Elena information about which remaining bloodline families were secretly communicating with Vivian, which pack members might be sympathetic to her cause, which weak points in compound security needed reinforcement. 2 weeks before the coronation, they caught their first spy, a common wolf named Peterson, who'd been passing security information to Vivian through encrypted emails. Garrett's interrogation revealed Peterson had been promised elevation to bloodline status once Vivian returned to power. The betrayal stung because Peterson had attended every reform meeting, voted in favor of pack restructuring, smiled to Sarah's face while selling out the wolves who'd fought for his equality. Marcus exiled Peterson without hesitation, but the incident prompted security reviews that uncovered 2 more potential collaborators. By week 3, paranoia had infected the compound like silver poisoning. No one knew who to trust. Every conversation felt monitored. The stress of constant vigilance wore down even the most committed reformers. Sarah found Marcus alone in his office late one night, reviewing tactical plans that had been revised 17 times already. He looked exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, the weight of 500 lives pressing down on shoulders that bore it without complaint, but not without cost. She knocked on the open door. "You should sleep. Big day tomorrow, final dress rehearsal for the ceremony." "Can't sleep. Keep running scenarios where we lose, where I make the wrong call and pack members die because I was too stubborn to cancel this ceremony." Marcus set down the tactical map he'd been studying. "Vivian's counting on my pride, on me refusing to show weakness by altering tradition. And she's right. I'm walking straight into her trap because the alternative is admitting the new Shadowpine is too fragile to defend itself." Sarah entered the office, closing the door behind her. Over 3 months, they developed a partnership that existed somewhere between professional alliance and personal connection. Not quite romance, not quite friendship, something undefined that worked better without labels. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same position she'd occupied dozens of times while they planned reforms and navigated political complications. "You're not walking into anything," she said firmly. "We're walking into it together." 75 volunteers who chose to fight instead of hide, 30 medics who learned triage in 3 weeks, 500 pack members who believe the future you're building is worth defending. You're not alone in this, Marcus. You never were. I made you a target. His voice carried guilt that had been building for 3 months. The night of the gathering, I painted a mark on your back by elevating you publicly. Everything that's happened since the assassination attempt, the political isolation, now this ceremony attack, it's all because I was tired of pretending and used you to prove a point. Can it be both? Sarah threw his own words back at him from that night. Can't you believe what you're doing is right and also have used me tactically? I'm not fragile, Marcus. I don't need protection from reality. I knew the risks when I wore that red dress, and I'd make the same choice again. Marcus studied her for a long moment, ice blue eyes searching hers. Why risk everything for a pack that treated you like you were disposable for 6 years? Because disposable people don't suddenly become valuable when leadership changes. The pack didn't change, you did. And then you created space for others to change too. Marie got her knee surgery. Thomas is studying engineering. 32 Omega workers sleep in rooms with heat and windows. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's revolution measured in warm beds and medical care, and the radical notion that birth doesn't determine worth. She leaned forward, holding his gaze. Tomorrow, Vivian's mercenaries will attack because bloodlines who've never created anything are terrified of losing power they never earned. They'll fail because competent wolves who've been underestimated their entire lives are going to prove that merit beats birthright every single time. And when it's over, we were going to keep building until no one remembers what it was like when Omegas were invisible. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Exhaustion giving way to determination she recognized from their first real conversation 3 months ago. You still believe that even knowing what's coming, especially knowing what's coming, the old shadow pine would have collapsed at the first real threat. We're going to survive because we're stronger than they ever were. Marcus stood moving around the desk to where Sarah sat. He offered his hand, and when she took it, he pulled her to her feet, but didn't release her. They stood close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the scars from 2 decades of military service, the lines around his eyes from carrying responsibilities that would have broken lesser wolves. When this is over, he said quietly, when we've survived whatever fresh hell tomorrow brings, I want to have a conversation we've been avoiding for 3 months. What conversation is that? The one about whether you're willing to stand beside me, not just as an ally or a symbol or a political partner, but as someone he stopped seeming to struggle with words, as someone who matters beyond the reforms we're building, someone I trust with more than just pack governance. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. That's a complicated conversation. Everything about us is complicated. Doesn't make it less worth having. Ask me again after we survive tomorrow, when we're not both exhausted and terrified and trying to prepare for battle. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face the way it always did. Deal. Survive first, complicated conversation second. He released her hand reluctantly, and Sarah left him to his tactical planning, but warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the office's heating system. 3 months ago, she'd been invisible. Tomorrow, she'd help defend a pack that had finally learned to see her. And after that, maybe there'd be space for conversations about futures that included something beyond constant crisis management. But first, they had to survive. The morning of the spring coronation dawned clear and cold, early spring sunlight filtering through trees that were just beginning to bud. The sacred grounds were located 3 miles from the compound's main buildings, a clearing in old-growth forest where shadow pine alphas had renewed their vows for 200 years. Stone markers ringed the space, each carved with names of previous leaders dating back to the pack's founding. At the center stood a raised platform of ancient wood worn smooth by generations of bare feet. 500 pack members gathered in careful formation that looked ceremonial but was actually tactical positioning designed by Garrett. Bloodline families occupied the eastern quadrant, their formal attire marking them as observers rather than participants. Common wolves filled the southern and western sections, their positions carefully chosen to provide maximum coverage of sight lines and approach vectors. Omega workers stood at the north, closest to evacuation routes, but also nearest to medical stations Sarah had set up in concealed locations. 75 trained volunteers were distributed throughout the crowd, indistinguishable from other pack members, except for the hand signals they'd practiced obsessively. 30 medics carried concealed supplies. Garrett commanded security from a position disguised as ceremonial witness. Elena monitored communications from the compound, ready to coordinate response if the attack came from unexpected directions. Marcus stood at the platform's center wearing traditional ceremonial robes, white linen, that left him visibly unarmed and vulnerable exactly as tradition required. The morning sun caught his silver-threaded hair, and Sarah thought he looked simultaneously like a warrior and a sacrifice. Beside him, Dr. Merrick served as ceremony officiant, his role requiring him to witness the Alpha's vows and confirm their acceptance by pack vote. Sarah stood among the Omega section wearing practical clothing under a ceremonial shawl, her medical bag concealed but accessible. Around her, pack members who'd never attended a coronation before watched with mixture of reverence and tension. Everyone knew an attack was coming. No one knew exactly when. Merrick's voice carried across the clearing, beginning the traditional opening. We gather at sacred grounds consecrated by generations of Shadow Pine Alphas. We come to witness renewal, to reaffirm bonds that make us pack, to honor traditions that connect us to those who came before. The ceremony followed ancient patterns, call and response, between alpha and pack vows spoken, and witnessed symbolic gestures that reinforced hierarchy while acknowledging mutual obligation. Marcus spoke the words their ancestors had spoken, his voice steady, despite knowing that mercenaries were likely positioning themselves in the surrounding forest. Sarah scanned the tree line, looking for movement that didn't belong. Beside her, Marie gripped her hand with surprising strength for someone 68 years old. Here, the elderly Omega whispered, they're coming. Motion flickered in the northern tree line shadows separating from forest, moving with military precision that marked them as the mercenaries Vivian had hired. 20 operators in tactical gear armed with weapons designed to kill werewolves efficiently. They emerged from concealment in coordinated fashion, weapons raised clearly, expecting minimal resistance. What they found instead was 75 wolves who'd spent 3 weeks training for exactly this moment. Garrett's voice cut through the ceremony with battlefield authority. Contact north, all units engage. Chaos erupted with surgical precision. Pack members who'd appeared to be casual observers dropped into combat stances, revealing weapons that had been concealed under ceremonial clothing. Common wolves who'd never fought coordinated like military units, using hand signals and tactical positioning that overwhelmed the mercenaries' initial advantage. Omega workers who'd been dismissed as weak civilian targets produced silver-resistant restraints and moved to secure the perimeter. The mercenaries adapted quickly. These were professionals who'd fought werewolves before. Silver rounds cut through pack defenses, and Sarah heard screams as wolves went down with wounds that wouldn't heal properly. She moved automatically, medical training, overriding fear, reaching the first casualty within seconds. Young enforcer named Daniels, the same wolf Marcus had saved 3 months ago during the Hunter attack. Silver round through his shoulder, bleeding heavily but conscious. Sarah packed the wound with pressure bandages while another medic covered her position. Around them, the battle raged with intensity that made the previous Hunter attack look like a skirmish. Stay down, Sarah ordered Daniels as she worked. You move before I stabilize this, you'll bleed out. The Alpha, Daniels tried to sit up, eyes tracking toward the platform where Marcus remained, still bound by ceremony protocols that required him to stay unarmed during renewal vows. The Alpha has 75 wolves defending him. You have me. Let them do their job so I can do mine. More casualties poured into Sarah's position. Marie appeared with Thomas, both carrying a stretcher they'd practiced with obsessively. Together, they evacuated wounded pack members to concealed medical stations where other medics worked under Dr. Merrick's coordination. The system they designed functioned imperfectly, but effectively. No one bled out waiting for treatment. Priorities stayed clear, even in chaos. Evacuation routes remained open despite the combat raging around them. At the platform, Marcus had finally shed ceremonial robes, revealing combat gear underneath a violation of tradition that the situation absolutely justified. He moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 20 years in military special operations and coordinating defensive positions through hand signals that Garrett's team executed flawlessly. The mercenaries' initial shock at facing organized resistance gave way to desperate aggression. They'd been promised easy targets and minimal opposition. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by wolves who fought with coordinated ferocity, who used terrain and positioning to offset superior equipment, who refused to break despite casualties. 15 minutes into the battle, Sarah heard the sound that meant everything changed, helicopter rotors approaching from the south. She looked up to see FBI helicopters bearing down on the sacred grounds, federal agents rappelling to ground before the aircraft even fully landed. Elena's voice crackled through concealed communication devices. FBI inbound as planned. Mercs are about to have a very bad day. Vivian had made a critical miscalculation. By hiring mercenaries and attacking during sacred ceremony, she'd crossed from pack politics into federal crimes, terrorism, murder for hire, interstate conspiracy. Elena had coordinated with Agent Morrison weeks ago, and federal law enforcement had been positioned nearby waiting for the attack that intelligence confirmed was coming. The remaining mercenaries found themselves caught between enraged werewolves and federal agents with legal authority to use lethal force. Most surrendered immediately. 3 tried to fight and were taken down by coordinated fire from both FBI and PAC enforcers. Within 20 minutes of the attack's start, it was over. Sarah worked through triage for another hour, treating wounds that ranged from minor silver burns to critical trauma that required immediate hospital transport. Final casualty count showed 8 PAC members seriously wounded, 15 with minor injuries, 3 mercenaries dead, 17 in FBI custody. No PAC fatalities, a miracle considering the opposition they'd faced. As federal agents processed the crime scene and medics handled final evacuations, Marcus found Sarah kneeling beside a wounded common wolf, her hands still bloody from treating trauma cases. He crouched beside her close enough that she could see exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "You all right?" His voice was rough from shouting battlefield commands. "I'm fine. How about you, Puidi?" "Alive," which is more than Vivian planned. He watched Sarah work for a moment, something like wonder in his ice blue eyes. "You trained 30 people to be combat medics in 3 weeks. Designed an evacuation system that functioned under fire. Saved lives that would have been lost if we'd relied on traditional medical response. That's what nurses do, Marcus. We keep people alive when systems try to kill them." He offered his hand, pulling her to her feet when she accepted. Around them, PAC members were helping each other, tending wounds, checking on friends and family. Bloodline families who'd resisted reform stood among common wolves and omegas, all of them survivors of an attack that had threatened everyone equally. Hierarchy seemed less important when you just fought shoulder to shoulder against enemies who didn't care about birth status. Dart Merrick approached his medic coat, splattered with blood, but his expression satisfied. "Final counts in. 8 critical evacuations to human hospitals. They'll heal, but it'll take time. 15 treated and released. 0 fatalities. Sarah, your triage system worked perfectly. We didn't lose anyone who made it to medical stations. We had good training and competent people. Thomas performed field surgery on a silver fragment extraction. Marie coordinated evacuation of 30 civilians under fire. They earned those saves, not me." "Take the credit," Marcus said quietly. "You've spent 6 years being invisible. Let people see what you've accomplished." Before Sarah could respond, Agent Morrison appeared with Elena at his side. The FBI supervisor looked grim, but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd just wrapped up a major case. "Alpha Stone, I need statements from everyone involved in security planning and tactical response. We've got 17 mercenaries in custody, and every single one is facing federal terrorism charges. Several are already negotiating testimony in exchange for reduced sentences." "Testimony about what?" Marcus asked, though Sarah suspected he already knew. "About who hired them, who provided intelligence on your ceremony location and security protocols, who transferred payment through offshore accounts we've been tracking for months." Morrison pulled out his phone, showing photographs that made Sarah's stomach drop. "We've got Vivian Blackwood in custody at her southern estate. Wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, about 15 other charges. She'll die in federal prison." The finality of it hit harder than Sarah expected. 3 months ago, Vivian had been untouchable, a bloodline aristocrat with enough power and connections to operate above PAC law. Now she was just another criminal facing consequences that wealth couldn't prevent. The system had worked. Not PAC justice that bloodlines could manipulate, but human law that treated everyone equally regardless of birth status. The other 6 families from the Council of Blood, Garrett asked, joining their group. "Cooperating fully in exchange for immunity on the assassination conspiracy. They're providing testimony about the embezzlement scheme, the Hunter attack 3 months ago, the whole operation. Lord Henrik's already turned over financial records that'll keep forensic accountants busy for years." Morrison's satisfaction was palpable. "You've effectively dismantled bloodline corruption in Shadowpine. The families still here are the ones who weren't involved or who cut deals to avoid prosecution. Your PAC's going to look very different going forward." It already looked different. As Sarah scanned the clearing, she saw bloodline families helping Omega workers treat injuries. Common wolves sharing water and supplies with PAC members they'd previously dismissed. Children from all ranks playing together near the medical stations, too young to understand. They were witnessing history, but absorbing lessons about equality that would shape their generation. Marcus thanked Morrison and coordinated with Garrett on security for the compound now that the immediate threat had passed. When federal agents began interviewing witnesses and processing evidence, he finally turned his full attention to Sarah. That conversation we talked about having that after we survived. I'm ready if you are. Sarah looked at the sacred grounds around them, blood-stained earth, where they'd defended the future they were building, stone markers bearing names of alphas, who'd ruled according to traditions that needed changing pack members, who'd fought because they believed in something worth protecting. This felt like the right place for complicated conversations. Ask me what you wanted to ask 3 months ago, she said, when you first put your hand on my back and guided me into that gathering hall. Marcus smiled, the expression that still transformed his face every time she saw it. I wanted to ask if you'd consider standing beside me. Not as an Omega I elevated to prove a point, not as a political symbol or an ally in reform, but as someone I trust with everything I am, everything I'm trying to build, as someone who matters more than pack governance and policy debates and all the practical reasons we work well together. He paused, seeming to search for words. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to explore what we could be if we stopped letting complications stop us. Sarah thought about 6 years of invisibility, thought about the red dress that had cost 3 months of wages and changed everything, thought about saving Marcus's life while he bled on silk sheets, about defending this pack against enemies who'd underestimated wolves they dismissed as weak, about building systems that measured worth through competence rather than birth. Yes, she said simply, to all of it. The complications, the partnership, the whatever this is that we've been avoiding defining. Yes. Marcus's smile widened into something close to joy, an expression Sarah suspected few wolves ever saw. He took her hand, and this time the touch felt different. Not tactical or professional or carefully neutral. Personal, intimate. The beginning of something they'd both been circling for 3 months without acknowledging. Good, he said, because I've been in love with you since you put that blanket on my shoulders and told me Omegas are trained to disappear. And I wanted you to know before we do this next part. What next part? The part where we finish the coronation ceremony. The part where I make new vows that actually reflect the pack we're building instead of traditions that needed changing. Marcus turned to address the pack members who remained on sacred grounds, bloodlines and common wolves and Omegas who'd fought together and survived together and were now witnesses to something unprecedented. Dermeric moved back to his position as officiant, understanding what Marcus intended even before he spoke. 3 months ago, I stood at this platform and promised reform. Marcus's voice carried across the clearing. I promised to lead with justice rather than tradition, to value merit over bloodline, to build a pack where no one has to be invisible to survive. Today, we prove those promises with blood and courage and the willingness to defend what we've built. So let me make new vows, real ones. He looked at Sarah, then his hand still holding hers. I vow to stand with wolves who fight rather than submit, to honor competence over birth, to build a pack where anyone can rise as far as their talent and character will carry them, to trust advisors who earn their positions instead of inheriting them, to love wolves who deserve it rather than one's tradition dictates I should. The last part wasn't standard ceremony language, but no one objected. Around the clearing, pack members who'd survived an attack together understood they were witnessing the old shadow pine dying and something new being born. Merrick's voice held warmth when he spoke the traditional response. Do we accept this alpha's vows? Do we bind ourselves to the pack he describes? Do we commit to defending what we've built together? The response came not in the traditional formal vote, but in a roar of approval from 500 wolves who'd just proven that the new shadow pine could survive anything. Bloodline families voted alongside common wolves and Omegas, all of them equals in this moment, if nowhere else yet. Then let it be witnessed and recorded, Merrick concluded. Marcus Stone remains Alpha of Shadow Pine Pack, leading us into a future we'll build together. The ceremony ended without the remaining traditional elements. They'd already been violated by combat and federal law enforcement, and continuing seemed pointless when the real point had already been made. Pack members began returning to the compound in groups organized by Garrett's security teams. Wounded were transported to the medical clinic where Dr. Merrick would coordinate ongoing care. FBI agents remained on site processing evidence and interviewing witnesses. Sarah found herself standing at the platform with Marcus after the clearing had largely emptied. Both of them still bloodied and exhausted, but somehow lighter than they'd been that morning. 3 months of constant crisis had resolved into something almost resembling peace. Vivian was in custody. The Council of Blood was dismantled. Shadowpine had defended itself successfully against the worst attack in decades. What happens now? Sarah asked. After the crisis, after the emergency, when we actually have to govern a pack that's not constantly under threat, we do the boring work of making sure reforms stick. We build institutions that don't depend on any single alpha's goodwill. We train the next generation to see omegas as equals so thoroughly that they can't imagine the old hierarchy. Marcus pulled her closer, his arms settling around her waist. And we figure out what us looks like when we're not constantly fighting for survival. That sounds terrifyingly normal. Probably why it terrifies me. I'm better at tactical operations than personal relationships. Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. Good thing I spent 6 years learning to exist in impossible situations. I'm excellent at navigating complicated territory. They stood together as spring sunlight filtered through old-growth forest as pack members moved past carrying wounded and supporting each other as the sacred grounds absorbed more blood and history and the evidence of change that came through struggle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, resistance from bloodlines who'd lost power, neighboring packs testing Shadowpine's resolve, the grinding daily work of transformation that never fully ended. But today they'd won. They'd defended a future worth building, and Sarah Chen, who'd spent 6 years being invisible, stood on sacred grounds, holding an alpha's hand, while 500 pack members acknowledged that she belonged here. Not because birth entitled her to it, because she'd earned it through competence and courage, and the willingness to fight for wolves who'd been dismissed as worthless. Forward. Always forward toward the future they were building together, one brave choice at a time. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the newly established Omega Advocacy Office, reviewing applications for the fall education semester. The office had expanded to 3 full-time staff members and handled everything from medical access to job placement to legal advocacy for PAC members navigating human systems. Thomas had started his engineering program and was already designing improvements to the compound's aging infrastructure. Marie coordinated a mentorship network that paired experienced Omegas with younger PAC members learning to navigate their new opportunities. The knock on Sarah's door preceded Marcus entering, without waiting for invitation, a casualty of 6 months of partnership that had evolved into something neither of them had quite defined, but both understood perfectly. He carried coffee from the compound's kitchen and wore the slight smile that meant he had news he thought she'd find interesting. Spring Council vote just concluded, he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Unanimous approval for expanding the education fund by another $2 million. Even the remaining bloodline families voted in favor. Because they've figured out that investing in all PAC members' development makes everyone more prosperous. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. Turns out when you stop letting 7 families steal resources, there's plenty of money for programs that actually benefit the PAC. Revolutionary concept. Who knew? Marcus's expression turned more serious. There's something else. The Northwest PAC Coalition wants to send delegates to observe our governance structure. 3 PACs are considering implementing similar reforms. Vivian's exile and federal prosecution apparently made bloodline corruption less appealing across the region. Sarah set down her coffee, processing implications. So we've gone from politically isolated to model PAC in 6 months. Apparently surviving an assassination attempt while implementing radical reform makes you interesting to other alphas who are tired of bloodline obstruction. Marcus reached across the desk, taking her hand. They specifically requested you be part of the delegation briefing. The Omega who helped design PAC restructuring. Not the Omega, an Omega, one of many who contributed. Take the credit, Sarah. You've earned it. They'd had this conversation dozens of times over 6 months, Sarah deflecting recognition, Marcus insisting she accept it. She'd saved lives, designed systems, proven that competence mattered more than birth. The PAC knew it. Other PACs were learning it. Only Sarah still struggled sometimes with the cognitive dissonance between 6 years of invisibility and 6 months of visibility. But she was learning, slowly, imperfectly. With Marcus's patient insistence, and Marie's fierce pride, and Thomas's gratitude, and the evidence of 32 Omega workers whose lives had fundamentally changed because someone finally acknowledged they mattered. Fine, Sarah conceded. I'll brief the delegates. But I'm bringing Marie and Thomas too. They represent the transformation better than I do. Deal. Marcus stood pulling her up with him close enough that she could see silver threading through his dark hair and count the scars from 20 years of military service. Now stop working and come to dinner. We have reservations at that restaurant in Port Angeles you've been wanting to try. We have reservations, as in you made plans without checking if I was available. I'm the Alpha. I can decree your availability. Sarah laughed, the sound coming easier after 6 months of practice. That's not how this partnership works, and you know it. Worth a try. Marcus kissed her, the gesture familiar now, but still capable of stealing her breath. Come to dinner. Let me take you somewhere nice where we can pretend to be normal wolves on a date instead of political partners managing pack reform. We're never going to be normal wolves on a date. Probably not, but we can pretend for a few hours. They left the Omega Advocacy office together, walking through compound corridors where pack members nodded greetings without differentiating between Alpha and former Omega, where bloodline children played with common wolf cubs and Omega pups without anyone remarking on it, where the visible evidence of transformation was so normal now that young wolves couldn't imagine it had ever been different. Sarah thought about the red dress hanging in her closet, cleaned and preserved, a reminder of the night everything changed. Thought about promises made on sacred grounds and defended with blood. Thought about complicated conversations that had led to partnership and something deeper that she'd stopped trying to define. The future they were building wasn't perfect. Resistance remained among wolves who missed the old hierarchy. Neighboring packs still tested Shadowpine's resolve. Every day brought new challenges that required navigation through uncharted territory. But forward, always forward toward the future they had bled to build one brave choice at a time. And Sarah Chen, who'd spent 6 years learning to disappear, walked through Shadowpine compound, holding an Alpha's hand visible and valued and exactly where she belonged.